For step 1, I've sketched an outline for this landscape scene using an HB pencil onto cold press watercolour paper, 300 grams. For step 2, I'm going to paint light washes, wet into wet, on the entire painting. And I mixed up there a puddle of cerulean, which is going to be for the sky, and a very dilute puddle of Hansa yellow light with a pinch of cerulean. I'm using my 1-inch flat brush to wet the paper. Now do take your time doing this. So I'm wetting right down to the bottom of the watercolour paper and loading my brush, painting the sky wet into wet. So these are all the light colours to begin with. I'm using my size 10 round brush. Loading my brush with that pale yellow green, painting wet into wet, that sort of distant field. I took this photograph myself on a recent trip that I made in the Lake District in England. And I just was so taken by the light coming through the trees, but also the details of the leaves. And I really wanted to paint this, and I really hope it inspires you to do the same. So I'm going to add a pinch of raw sienna to that light green, painting it damp into wet there, also in the foreground, loading my brush and painting wet into wet pretty much in the foreground. And I am going to add a little bit more of the cerulean here with a little bit of the Hansa yellow light, about 50-50 to make a limey green. And I'm adding some of that raw sienna as well, just to make it a little bit earthy. And I am painting the sort of little bit of green there in the distant fields, damp into wet with my size 10 brush. I still want to keep that light there though in the distance, but watercolours dry so much lighter. I'm mixing up 2 cool greens here, starting off with cobalt blue and a pinch of quinacridone gold, and it's mostly a blue-green, so 70% blue, 30% yellow. This is phthalo green. You can still use the cobalt blue with the raw sienna and the Hansa yellow light. I'm using a natural sponge, and I'm sponging that cobalt blue mixed with the quinacridone gold and the phthalo green mixed with the raw sienna and the Hansa yellow light. But they're kind of more cool green colours, less of the yellows, more of the blues or greens. And I'm tapping this gently on top of the sky, damp into damp, to get some soft fuzzy textures. And that softness and the coolness will create depth in your painting because it will recede and look further away. So I'm tapping some of the trees on the right hand side here, damp into damp, just using the sort of corner of the sponge there, again just to create soft textures. Mixing up some more cobalt blue with that phthalo green and the raw sienna, so it's a real sort of blue-green colour. Painting this damp into damp right on the horizon, and just to create some darks at the bottom of the trees, but they're quite pale though, to give the illusion that they're a lot further away. And I'm painting this with my size 6 brush, damp into damp, to the trees on the right hand side here. I'm going to add a pinch of the Hansa yellow light to that cobalt blue. I'm just painting the field below there, damp into wet with the size 6 brush. And just adding a little bit more detail there on the horizon, painting smaller trees here and there. I'm mixing up Hansa yellow light into that cobalt blue, painting this yellow green in the foreground on the right hand side using my size 10 round brush. Adding some more of the phthalo green into that yellow, a little bit more yellow, and some of the quinacridone gold. It's a lovely rich sort of mid-green. Painting sort of almost wet into wet in the foreground, but damp into damp if you like, and just covering this sort of mid-green in that foreground area in the middle and to the left there. Remember to keep loading your brush as I'm doing there, and just painting these sort of mid-green marks here and there, damp into damp. I'm just painting between the sort of fence posts there, and really loading that brush and painting that foreground area, almost painting sort of more sort of different sort of marks just here and there, smaller marks as it goes further off into that middle ground there. And I'm just spritzing the foreground because it actually dried a little bit here, so I'm just spritzing, allowing the paint to run down as well. And I'm tilting it upside down to allow the sort of watery paint to run up. And this is to create some lovely textures in the foreground and to keep everything super loose. So mixing up some more phthalo green here with the quinacridone gold. Loading my brush, I'm just painting pretty much almost wet into wet on that left hand side because I've spritzed that area with water, it's diluted everything. So I'm tilting, applying this sort of slightly darker sort of green here, wet into wet, tilting, allowing it all to run down to create some nice atmospheric sort of marks, etc. Almost kind of misty. And remember, this is your first layer, so you can really have some fun with it. So I wanted to create some sort of texture in the sort of top of the foreground going into the middle ground. So I'm mixing up some of the phthalo green, you can use the cobalt blue, and I'm actually using a little bit of raw sienna, and you can also use a little bit of yellow. And it's to create this warm mid-tone green. And I'm using my size 6 round brush, just using the tip of the brush just to paint these grasses here, damp into damp. If the paint is running too much, you saw there I took the excess paint off on the paper towel to ensure that my brush is damp and not too wet, because I want to create the texture of those grasses, but I want to keep them soft so they kind of look like they're going a little bit further away, and it kind of distinguishes the foreground from that middle ground and the distance as well. So I'm painting a few sort of those marks there in that foreground, damp into damp, varying the brush marks and working my way down, and just adding a little bit to the side here, all damp into damp. And to the right hand side, and this is real time, so I'm just painting quickly, I'm not speeded up the video at all. I'm just using the paper towel to lift out some of the green on the fence post there, just to keep those a little bit lighter, and I'll paint those later. And I am just adding a little bit more dark there to the horizon, so just beneath the trees there, damp into damp, using the cobalt blue with a little bit of quinacridone gold and my size 4 round brush. So I can work in this area as long as there is a sheen on the paper. If the paper looks matte, don't add any more paint to this area, because you may get cauliflowers which would actually come forward because they create textures and dark edges. So I'm only doing this because there is still a sheen on the paper, which allows me to paint damp into damp. But if you aren't sure, just leave this area. You can always add this later, wet on dry. I'm just adding a few marks there at the top of the field, damp into damp, using the cobalt blue mixed with the quinacridone gold, using my size 6 round brush. And it's about 70% yellow and 30% blue, because you want it to be quite pale in colour so it recedes. And just adding a little bit to the left hand side here, damp into damp. I'm going to allow my painting to dry. And I just wanted to discuss how much paler those washes look once dry. It never ceases to amaze me how much paler watercolour does dry. So you always have to work that just that little bit darker, because you'll find you almost have to repeat the painting to build up that tonal value. So for step 3, I'm going to be building up the detail in the foreground. So I'm spritzing the foreground with my spritzer bottle, and it creates this lovely sort of speckledy water effect. Now I'm using sap green. You can still carry on using your cobalt blue, but I'm just tickling this sap green on with my size 8 brush. And as you can see there, the lovely texture you get when you sort of paint on top of an area where you spritz, it kind of catches those water droplets and spreads. and I thought it'd be quite a nice technique to show you. I must say though, the painting was drying quite quickly. The room was quite warm, so I will be spritzing again as well. But I'm just tickling this sap green on here, which is a really nice mid green, but you can also add a little bit of blue to it to make it slightly darker, or a yellow to make it sort of lighter and a more of a lighter sort of yellow green colour. So I've swapped to my size 6 brush here, and I'm just tickling this sap green on, loading the brush and allowing that paint to kind of spread a little bit and catch those water droplets here and there. So just softening some of the hard edges at the top there using a clean damp brush. And I'm going to use some table salt and sprinkling it onto the damp paint, and that will absorb some of the paint to create lovely light textures, and you can see that develop as the painting is drying naturally. So for step 4, I'm going to paint wet on dry the light leaves that are in the foreground. So I have used sap green mixed with Hansa yellow light. So you've got a sort of light yellow green colour. I'm using my size 8 round brush, and I am pretty much painting wet on dry, varying my brush strokes. Don't overthink this. Just use the brush and just paint these light leaf colours here and there, varying the size, varying the sort of shapes, etc. Paint once and carry on. Just trust the process. If you overthink it and start sort of changing it, it won't look as sort of fresh and as free. So just paint these sort of almost abstract marks here and there, small, medium and large marks using the tip of the brush. You can even change your brush, varying the sizes as well. I was just adding a little bit more sap green here, but it was slightly too thick. I forgot to add the yellow, but I just wanted to discuss that. I've just added more yellow now, but you can see the difference that not adding the yellow makes to that sap green. It's a lot sort of lighter and more of a yellow green when you add the yellow to that sap green. So just painting a few more marks here and there. I don't want to overdo it because I want to be able to see the sort of background coming through, that lovely light coming through. So try to sort of miss out the middle area there. Don't overpaint it, even if you can see it in the photograph. So I've mixed up some raw sienna, diluted raw sienna there, and painting some of the fence posts here in the sort of middle ground, wet on dry, using my size 4 round brush, and also the fence posts in the foreground on the right hand side. And remember what I said at the beginning of this tutorial is I removed that fence post in the middle ground, in the centre there. I felt it didn't work, so you may not need to do this stage, but I am painting the fence post to the right here, sort of wet on dry, using my size 6 round brush, little bit of quinacridone rust. You can use burnt sienna as well, along with the raw sienna. So mixing up some sap green here with the quinacridone rust, painting the fence post just here and there. There's sort of dappled light on there as well, so I want to capture that as well. But just sort of painting this mid-tone here using my size 6 brush with a mixture of the brown and green. And now I'm just using the paper towel just to lift off some of the paint so it kind of looks like sort of sunlight through the trees there onto the fence posts. I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. And as you can see there, it's created some lovely light textures here and there. So I'm going to use some masking fluid to mask out some leaves in the foreground. I'm using an old synthetic brush which I've dipped into hand liquid soap, which protects the brush while you're using the masking fluid. And I'm just painting leaf shapes here and there, and it's quite a nice way of creating light leaves later after you've added darker washes. So you can add as many of these as you like. You can paint over some of the salt textures as well, but it really kind of builds up those layers in the foreground. For step 6, I am going to paint the mid-tone leaves in the foreground using sap green and a pinch of cobalt blue. And I'm going to use my size 8 round brush, painting wet on dry. So you can paint through some of the gaps, but also on top of those lighter leaves, but leaving sort of a light edge where the sunlight has caught the edge of the leaf. So you can vary the marks, vary the sizes, and let your brush dance across the paper. What I would say is make sure you don't sort of overpaint that you lose the light. So remember, less is more. I'm using my size 6 round brush just to paint in little sort of foliage details, varying the marks there in the foreground area using the sap green and cobalt blue. Just varying those marks again, building up the detail in the foreground. I've swapped to my size 8 round brush, mixing more of the sap green and cobalt blue for that sort of mid to dark tonal value, and just building up the sort of corners of that foreground as well. That's where you want everything to be quiet, not too much information, not too much contrast. You want that sort of through the center, bringing your eye into the middle ground and off into the distance. So just adding this detail, and remember I've masked out some of the leaves there as well. So this dark painted on top will be really kind of effective once you remove the masking fluid, because you'll have that lovely sort of mid-tone leaf there suddenly appear as well. So back to the size 4 round brush, adding some more little details just here and there, building up the sort of information in the foreground there, sort of different foliage, different plants, etc., and grasses. So mixing up some of the quinacridone rust with the cobalt blue to make a dark brown. I'm just painting some darks and details on the fence posts using my size 6 round brush. So leaving light areas where the sunlight has sort of gone through the trees there to create that lovely dappled light effect there. Doing the same to the posts in the centre here in the middle ground, a little bit lighter, so I've added some water to that quinacridone rust, and I've added a touch of the sap green there. But remember, I do remove this later, so you may not need to do this. But if you want to include it, just keep it a little bit paler so it looks further away. I'm just adding some paler grasses there, just at the bottom of the post, wet on dry, and a few more grasses here and there in the foreground, using the sap green with a pinch of the cobalt blue. So keeping it to this mid to dark tonal value, I am working light to dark, so I'm getting to those sort of darker tonal values, building up the detail here using my size 6 round brush. And I'm also using the sap green on its own there, literally got it straight from the pan, using my size 8 round brush now, getting those sort of slightly darker marks there in the foreground, working damp into damp. It amazes me how this process of working light to dark, building up that detail, really starts to create a 3D image. I'm just spattering here in the center of the foreground to finish this stage. I'm going to allow the painting to dry once more. For step 7, I am working on those darkest tonal values. So this is sap green mixed with a pinch of Paynes grey. So I am painting over the top of some of those leaves, maybe in an empty gap as well, and just using my size 6 round brush to paint these leaves. Remember, you can sort of paint part of the leaf and then allow a light part to be on the edge so it looks sort of like the sun has caught the edge of the leaf. but vary your brush marks and just let that brush dance across the painting. And try to keep those dark marks bigger in the foreground here, but sort of towards the edge and the bottom, but allow sort of more light to travel through the center. So protect the light there. You're telling a story. You're getting the viewer to look through this foliage off to the distance there. So again, sort of painting those marks at the top. You can see how my wrist is moving. So I create a variety of brush marks there as well. I've had a little bit of phthalo green there as well, just to make that sort of dark, rich and vibrant. For step 8, I am going to paint the tree trunks and branches. Now they're almost silhouetted in the painting. So I am using the quinacridone rust. You can use burnt sienna or even burnt umber. And I've mixed some Paynes grey with it. You could use black. And I'm using my size 6 round brush to paint the main darkest, largest branches in that foreground there. And I'm also going to paint the fence posts using that dark there, so you can see it really comes forward and it gives your painting structure as well. Again, I'm painting this sort of middle distance fence post here, and as I start to add the dark, to me immediately it doesn't look right. It kind of looks busy and it kind of takes the light away. It's like a full stop in my painting, and it stops the viewer to look beyond those lovely trees in the distance. So that's why I decided to take it out. But here I'm just painting some of the darks and details, wet on dry, with my size 6 brush on the fence post, in the grasses, etc. Just really building up that depth. Remember, don't be afraid of the dark. So I am using my liner brush now with that lovely dark Paynes grey and brown mix, and I'm painting the twigs wet on dry. Now, if you don't have a liner brush, don't worry. You could use a twig, even a sharpened twig using a pencil sharpener, or a small round brush or a rigger brush. But here you get these lovely sort of thin lines using a thin brush or a twig even. So they're quite a little bit paler, but again, they give structure to your painting. You can also paint some thin grasses if you want to as well. But it's kind of all around the sort of outside of the painting and just building up these details now. Painting in the sort of wire for the fence here, wet on dry. You can see how it gives structure to the painting. I just love this process of working light to dark. I kind of know which way it's going to take me. Just adding a little bit more dark there to the branch and sort of scumbling there just around the edge, just to fill in a little bit more dark on the edge of the painting, a few more sort of smaller twigs, etc. here and there, all wet on dry. I've swapped back to my size 6 brush. I'm just adding this dark now, the Paynes grey, the quinacridone rust with some sap green as well, and just adding a few more darks and details just to finish off this stage. I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. For step 9, I'm removing the washi tape to reveal a lovely white border. I'm using framing tape. You can use masking tape, your thumb, or even a putty rubber to remove the masking fluid. Make sure your painting is dry. If you don't, you could tear your paper or smudge your painting. So as you can see there, I've got some lovely light leaves and I'm so pleased with it. And I really recommend that technique of sort of masking out sort of the mid or light tone colours and painting darks around them. As I discussed earlier, I'm removing the posts in the middle ground there. So I'm using a sponge, clean water, and just lifting off. And keep repeating this until you can lift off most of the paint, and then use a paper towel to take off any excess moisture. So here is the finished painting. I love the light coming through the area where I lifted off the post there. So I really hope you enjoyed this step-by-step tutorial. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. If you would like to learn more about my Patreon watercolour membership, please see the description below, but there you will get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, extended tutorials, downloadable outline sketches, and a downloadable PDF with step-by-step progress photographs and instructions. More details about this can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.